No one in Duskwood dared ask why Martha Lane's house cried out every night, but the answer would shatter them all. No one in Duskwood ever dared to ask why Martha Lane's old cabin echoed with muffled cries every night. Folks just hurried on past, pretending the sorrow wasn't theirs to claim. But behind that weathered door a secret waited, a truth so dark it could shake the whole town to its core. The night everything changed, silence finally met its match. Duskwood, Texas lay sunk in dust and long shadows when night dropped its heavy hand. Folks said it was peaceful, but that was just a way of talking. Like how some wounds never really close, they just get quieter over the years. When the sky went purple and the last wagon rumbled home, Martha Lane's cabin at the edge of the valley turned to a cold, unlit place. From the church steps you could hear her crying if you had the mind to listen. Most folks learned not to. Nobody in Duskwood liked to meddle, not with what went on behind closed doors. Martha Lane, a woman of 50 and hard used by the years, kept her hair tied back in a gray braid and moved with a quiet, stubborn patience. Her eyes were washed out blue and her hands shook when she paid for flour at Ms. Lottie's store. She showed up at church every Sunday in the same faded dress, eyes downcast, no questions asked or answered. Folks respected that kind of silence. Some thought it was dignity, others called it pride. But everyone saw the bruises, new and old, blooming down her arms, peeking from under her collar when the wind caught her scarf wrong. She came and went like a ghost. Some wondered how long it'd be before she just disappeared altogether. Her boy, Roy Lane, was 18, but his face was already etched deep, eyes like river stones, always watching, always hard. Folks said he used to be a gentle child, always clinging to his mother's skirts, but these days Roy came and went like a storm, carrying that old leather whip draped over his shoulder, the way a lawman might carry a badge. He slept half the day, haunted the saloon at night, slouched on the porch with a bottle of rotgut and a sneer for anyone who passed too close. People in Duskwood kept out of his way. They had learned, a year after Mr. Lane's accident out on the ridge, that Roy wasn't the kind of boy you tried to reason with. He drank like he meant to forget and lashed out at anything that reminded him who he was. Martha cooked his meals, swept the porch, mended his shirts. Each morning she watered the dusty geraniums by the window, careful not to look too long at the trail of boot prints in the yard. Each evening she braced herself as the hour grew late and Roy staggered in. Some nights, if you were out by the post office, you'd hear him shouting, hear a thud, a crash, then that low, muffled crying. The whip snapped sometimes, but mostly it was just the raw ache of something breaking, over and over. One night, Roy came home meaner than usual. He slammed the door so hard the lamp on the mantel wobbled. Martha froze with a spoon in her hand. He cursed, knocked over a chair, shouted about the stew being cold. The neighbors heard every word, but their windows stayed dark. That same week, Reverend Harlan walked past the Lane place as Roy was dragging his mother out by the arm, yelling about the money she spent at the store. Harlan hesitated, the Bible heavy in his hands, but Roy glared at him, daring him to speak. The Reverend looked away, hurrying on. Folks in town just looked at their boots and told themselves it wasn't their business. Nobody wanted trouble with Roy Lane. On the hill above the town, old Elias Boone watched it all with tired, knowing eyes. His own house stood lonely on a patch of wild prairie, half-rotted fence, a single lamp burning through the night. Some said he was crazy, that losing his wife and little girl years back had turned him strange. But Elias still kept an eye on Duskwood, especially on Martha. He rode past her cabin every morning, tipped his hat if she looked up, left a chunk of firewood on her step when he could spare it. Never spoke much, but folks knew he'd seen his share of darkness and had learned how to walk alongside it. Billy Crow, the old man next door, sometimes sat on his porch, chewing tobacco, listening to the racket drift across the night air. He'd been a friend of Martha's late husband, but now he just shook his head, spat into the dust, and turned up his collar. Nothing in Duskwood moved after dark, not since Roy Lane started carrying that whip. That winter the cold seeped through every crack in Martha's little house. The stove sputtered, the wind howled, but the fear hung heavier than either. One night, Roy slammed his fist through the window when she couldn't find his boots fast enough. Glass glittered in the lamplight. Her hands bled as she swept it up, and Roy just laughed, the sound sharp as flint. Later, as she sat at the kitchen table, pressing a rag to her palm, Martha stared at the door and wondered if she could ever lock it tight enough. Sleep never came easy in Duskwood, and when it did, it brought dreams that left Martha waking in a cold sweat, heart pounding, waiting for the next storm to break. Martha Lane's dreams were small and simple, the kind that could slip between your fingers if you squeezed too tight. She only wanted a day without shouting, a warm meal eaten in peace, a night where the wind outside was the only thing that rattled her bones. There were moments she remembered. Long ago, Roy laughing in the sun, trailing after her in the yard, cheeks full and red from apples picked in late summer. In those quiet flashes, she forgot the man he'd become and saw only the boy she'd loved. Most days, though, the past felt farther than the horizon. Roy barely looked at her now, except to sneer or demand something. He spent his afternoons in town, coming home half drunk, voice thick and mean. The house shrank. Around Martha, every wall closing in a little tighter, every step echoing too loud. She barely left the cabin except to walk to Miss Lottie's store for bread or sit in the last pew at church, her eyes fixed on the hymnal, praying for something she couldn't name. Sometimes, when the whiskey loosened his tongue, Roy let slip the ache that hollowed him out. One night, slumped at the table, eyes red-rimmed and wild, he muttered, "If Pa hadn't left, none of this'd be like it is. Maybe if you weren't so weak, Ma?" His words hung in the air like smoke. Martha didn't reply. She just gripped the edge of her chair, waiting for the storm to pass. Across the valley, Elias Boone watched over his own patch of loneliness. He'd lived alone so long his voice felt foreign in his own mouth. Every morning he saddled his old mare, rode the fence line, and kept watch on the world below. He noticed things: boot tracks by Martha's door, a broken lamp left out on the porch, a fresh bruise along her cheek one Sunday morning at church. He said nothing, but he saw it all. Sometimes he left a basket of eggs or a slab of bacon by her steps. No note, just a gesture that said, "I know you're there." Elias remembered what it was to be a husband, a father. The winter his wife and daughter died took the marrow from his bones, left him half the man he'd been. Now he lived quiet, but some hurts wouldn't let a man rest. He watched Roy Lane with a cautious eye, saw the wildness in him, the danger simmering just below the surface. The town itself was a fortress of silence. Folks whispered about the Lane cabin, but nobody did a damn thing. They'd look away if Roy stumbled past, face flushed with anger, whip looped over his shoulder. When Martha walked to church, heads bowed politely, but eyes slid sideways, tracking every step she took. Sometimes Reverend Harlan would offer a soft word at the end of service. "If you need anything, Martha, you just say so." But she only nodded, quiet as falling snow. One cold evening, Roy crashed through the door in a drunken fury. He smashed a lamp, kicked over a chair, then turned on Martha with a rage so sharp it sucked all the air from the room. "You think you're better than me? Going to church, pretending like nothing's wrong?" His voice cracked, tears swimming in his eyes, but his hands were fists and his heart all spite. He tore at her dress, flung dishes across the room, then collapsed onto the floor, weeping in a way that sounded more animal than man. Martha gathered up the broken pieces in silence, knees stiff, back aching. She didn't weep. She'd run out of tears years ago. Instead, she stacked the broken china, folded her torn dress, and sat by the fire with her hands clenched tight until the shaking stopped. That night she stared at the ceiling, listening to Roy's snoring from the next room, her mind drifting to a world where the days were soft, the nights safe, and the man her son had become was just a nightmare she could wake from. In the hush before dawn, she allowed herself one small wish that someone, anyone, would remember she was alive. Outside, a lone coyote called to the moon. Down the hill, Elias Boone watched the light in Martha's window flicker, then fade. He tipped his hat to the darkness, his heart aching for something he couldn't save. Martha Lane moved through the days as if she were sleepwalking, trapped in a house she'd swept 1,000 times and still never felt was her own. Each bruise healed just in time for another, like flowers pressed under glass, pale reminders of everything she never said. She swept the stoop, hung the wash, patched Roy's shirts, all while holding her breath. She was always waiting for the next outburst, the next storm, the next apology that never came. Fear settled in her bones and made its home there. It twisted her up so tight she sometimes forgot she had hands of her own. She hardly spoke in town, just nodded to Miss Lottie or past Reverend Harlan with a polite, hollow smile. When folks asked after her, she answered with her eyes lowered, "We're getting by." But nobody pressed her. In Duskwood, minding your business was the only way to keep the peace. At night, Roy's boots thudded up the porch steps, the sound as steady and unwelcome as thunder. He'd slam the door, toss his hat down, and Martha would tense, shoulders rising, breath caught. Some nights he barely said a word, just poured himself whiskey and stared at the fire, jaw twitching. Other times he was cruel, eyes bright and mean, tongue sharp as barbed wire. Once he threatened, voice low and trembling, "If you ever tell a soul, Ma, I'll burn this house to the ground. You hear me? I'll make you wish you never opened your mouth." She did hear. She believed him. The words stuck to her skin like the scent of smoke. After, she went outside in the dark, walked barefoot through the field, shivering under a sky too wide to comfort her. She found herself at the old graveyard by the willow, knees buckling in front of the weathered stone that marked her husband's resting place. She pressed her face to the cold granite and let the tears come silent and hot. "What did I do wrong?" she whispered. How did I lose him?" But the stone had no answers, just the hush of wind and the creak of the gate swinging loose. She stayed there until the first light crept over the hills, then stumbled home, colder than when she left. The secret heavier on her shoulders. Roy's anger had a story, but Martha didn't dare speak it. He'd found out about his father's secret, the affair, the night he rode off in a rage, never to come home again. Something broke in Roy that day, a bitter seed planted deep. Now all the shame, all the questions came out sideways, against Martha, against the world. Still, she kept his secrets just as she kept her own. She washed his bloody shirts, set a plate for him at every meal, prayed over him as he slept, though he'd never know it. Some days she loved him so much it hurt to look at him. Other days she wished he'd disappear. When Roy raged, he'd sometimes shout, "You're weak, Ma! That's why Pa left. That's why nobody cares." Martha wanted to scream back, want to tell him what really happened, how she'd tried to keep the family together, how she'd forgiven things a son should never know. But the words died on her tongue. One late afternoon, the sky bruised with storm, Roy burst in, wild-eyed, whiskey on his breath, fists clenched. "You talking to folks, Ma? You running your mouth at church?" Martha shook her head, trembling. He raised his hand, and she flinched, but he only grabbed the oil lamp and hurled it against the wall, glass shattering. "Next time you think of talking, remember what I said," he hissed. That night, Martha barely slept. She lay awake, listening for the sound of the wind, the distant howl of a coyote, anything but the silence that pressed so hard on her chest she could barely breathe. In the distance, up on his lonely ridge, Elias Boone watched the Lane house through his spyglass, saw a shadow move past the curtain, saw a woman's shape stooped and small. He wondered how long a heart could bear such hurt before it turned to stone. Dawn broke gray and restless, and Martha rose to start another day, fear stitched into every step she took. Elias Boone wasn't a man of many words, but he'd seen enough in 50 years to know the difference between minding your own business and turning your back. He'd buried a wife and 2 daughters by the time he was 40, and since then he'd kept mostly to his ranch in the quiet company of the hills. The folks in Duskwood said he preferred cattle to people, and maybe they weren't wrong. Still, he saw what happened in the Lane house. Everyone did. They just called it someone else's trouble and left it at that. But not Elias. He watched the comings and goings from his own porch, eyes sharp as the hawks circling over the valley. He noticed the new bruises on Martha's arms and the hollow in her cheeks. He saw Roy's wild gait when he stumbled home after dark, the leather strap swinging from his belt like a flag. There were other eyes on the Lane house, too. Billy Crow, the blacksmith, who'd turn away when Roy passed, but always left a lantern burning on his shop porch just in case. Ms. Lottie, who ran the general store, slipped a loaf of bread into Martha's hands now and then, no charge and no questions, but fear hung over the town like a storm cloud that never quite broke. Folks whispered in corners, telling themselves it wasn't their place. Every time Martha limped into church, Reverend Harlan's prayers grew a little softer, his gaze a little heavier. Then there was Frank Buckley, a big man with cold blue eyes and too much say in how things ran around Duskwood. He ran a band of rough boys, the kind who liked trouble for its own sake, and lately they'd taken to stopping by Roy's place on Friday nights. They drank and laughed too loud, leaving muddy boot prints on Martha's porch, looking for anything not nailed down. Word was Buckley used the Lane land for his own dealings, bootleg whiskey, stolen cattle, and sometimes worse. Elias started leaving a note for Martha tucked under the chipped flower pot beside her steps. "If you ever need a hand, hang a red scarf from your window." He wasn't sure she'd see it, wasn't even sure she'd dare. Some nights Martha sat by the lamplight, hands shaking as she stitched the old red handkerchief she'd once used for her hair. She never hung it out. One night, Buckley and his crew came pounding on the Lane door, shouting for Roy, asking for their share. Martha opened the door a crack, heart pounding, telling them Roy wasn't home. Buckley shoved her aside, boys pouring into the tiny house, tearing through cupboards and drawers. They found nothing but left her sprawled on the floor, lips split, trembling. After they'd gone, Martha crawled to the hearth, gathered the broken pieces of her mother's teacup, and pressed them into her apron. She didn't cry. She just rocked back and forth, whispering a prayer for strength she didn't believe would come. The next morning the town talked in low voices. No one mentioned Buckley by name, but everyone knew. Ms. Lottie brought Martha a fresh bandage, eyes averted. Reverend Harlan lingered on her doorstep, asking if she'd like him to say a blessing over the house. Martha smiled weakly, told him she'd pray enough for the both of them. Elias Boone rode down to the river at dusk, his horse picking a careful path through the cottonwoods. He thought about what it meant to help a neighbor, about how the West could turn a good man hard if he let it. As the sun slipped behind the hills, Elias looked back at the Lane place, saw the lamp burning late, saw Roy's shadow at the window, restless and sharp. He wondered how much longer he could just watch. In a land that forgave so much, maybe silence was the worst sin of all. The night after Buckley's gang tore through her house, Martha Lane sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the letter she'd found under her door. The handwriting was rough, the lines uneven. "You are not alone. There is someone left in this world who cares what happens to you. Don't be afraid to ask for help." The words didn't say much, but the weight behind them pressed against the ache in her chest. Roy didn't notice the letter at first. He came home late, meaner than usual, smelling of smoke and cheap whiskey. He kicked his boots off in the kitchen, tossed his hat on the floor, and glared at Martha. "What's this?" he slurred, snatching the paper from her lap. She didn't answer. Her hands shook. Roy scanned the note, jaw tightening, and in a flash of rage, he backhanded her so hard she toppled sideways, the letter fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. He grabbed the leather strap from the wall. Martha tried to curl away, but the blows fell quick and merciless, each crack echoing in the lonely wooden room. It was the first time her voice broke, raw, desperate, not a scream but something deeper, the cry of a soul that's finally hit bottom. The neighbors heard, but no one came. No one except Elias Boone. Elias had been drifting along the fence line, watching the Lane house with that quiet worry only men who've lost too much ever really know. He stopped short when he heard Martha's voice, raw and piercing, carried by the wind across the dark grass. He could feel his own breath catch in his chest, memories of his wife's illness and his daughter's small, broken voices pressing down on him. He drew his pistol but kept it low, hidden in his coat, and waited, because the West had taught him that if you moved too soon, you only made things worse. Inside, Roy finally tired himself out, the rage in him spent like a busted match. He left Martha curled on the floor, her sobs muffled by her own arm. He staggered to his room, slammed the door, and collapsed into a restless, whiskey-soaked sleep. Long after the house grew quiet, Martha sat up. Her face was bruised, her hands bloodied, but there was a strange steadiness in her now, like something had snapped and would never be the same again. She lit a lamp and found the red handkerchief she'd been saving all these years. Her fingers trembled as she folded it. Then, just before dawn, she crept to the window and hung it from the sill. Elias saw it first, a flash of color in the gray morning. He waited until Roy left, then made his way up the path, boots silent on the cold dirt. Martha opened the door without a word. He saw the bruises, the split lip, the old grief made new again. He didn't say much, just pressed a small loaf of bread into her hand, a nod, a whisper. "I'm still here." For the first time in months, Martha felt the faintest thread of hope tug at her heart. She let herself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to survive all this alone. The sun rose heavy and uncertain over Duskwood. The Lane house stood silent, a sagging shape at the end of the valley road. Martha didn't go to the market that morning. She didn't show up for church either. Word spread quick, like it always did in small towns. By noon, folks were whispering in Lottie's store, shaking their heads, but no one did more than talk. Elias Boone watched the Lane place from his porch, hands tight around a battered tin mug. He hadn't slept. The red handkerchief had been gone from the window by daylight, but its memory haunted him, reminded him of all the things he hadn't done, all the people he'd failed. He waited as long as he could. Then, just before noon, he saddled his horse and rode down the hill. He stopped at Lottie's, made up some story about needing milk. Ms. Lottie, sharp-eyed and knowing, handed him the jug without a word. "Don't take too long, Elias," she said, voice low. "Roy Lane's been looking for trouble since sunrise." Elias nodded. The ride from the store to Martha's house took only minutes, but it felt longer than all the lonely years he'd lived since his wife and daughter died. When he reached the gate, the yard was empty, but the front door was ajar. hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the quiet was thick, broken only by the scrape of Roy's boots against the floor. Martha was on her knees, scrubbing blood from the boards with a rag. Her hair was loose around her face, eyes swollen nearly shut. Roy stood over her, belt in hand, chest heaving. Elias stepped inside without knocking. The room shrank around them. "Put it down, Roy," he said, voice quiet as thunder. "Don't make me ask twice." Roy turned, eyes wild. "Ain't none of your business, Boone." Elias moved slow, all patience and danger. "You made it my business." The next few moments were chaos, the kind only men who've lost everything know how to walk through. Roy swung the belt. Elias caught it midair, twisted, and for a heartbeat the two men struggled, breathing hard, boots slipping on the floor. Martha pressed herself against the wall, trembling, silent. The neighbors peered out from behind curtains, but no one stepped in. Elias didn't fight with anger. He fought with a kind of tired purpose, the need to end something that had been left to rot for far too long. He pinned Roy to the ground, wrestled the belt away, and looked him dead in the eye. "You're finished," he said, low and final. Roy spat blood, shame, and rage twisted together. He shoved Elias off, stormed from the house, slamming the door so hard a pane of glass shattered. Out in the yard, Frank Buckley's men watched, but not one of them stepped forward. Inside, Martha finally collapsed, the rag slipping from her hand. Elias caught her before she hit the ground. He carried her to the old settee, careful not to touch the worst bruises. He sat with her until her breathing slowed, until the worst of the shaking passed. By sundown, every soul in Duskwood knew what had happened. They whispered about Elias Boone, the quiet man on the hill, who'd finally stepped off his land and done what nobody else dared. But for Martha, there was only relief and a sorrow so old it felt almost peaceful. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the dark. After Elias Boone left that battered house, a hush fell over Duskwood, the kind of hush that comes just before a prairie storm. Martha Lane lay on her old settee, the smell of lye and blood thick in her nose, staring at the warped ceiling. All the years she'd managed to hide her bruises, all the time she'd forced her hands steady in church, none of it mattered now. Folks would talk, folks would judge, but not a soul could say she hadn't tried to protect her boy. She dozed off, then startled awake near sundown to the scrape of a chair. Elias had come back just to check on her, hat in hand, boots left respectfully by the door. He didn't ask if she was all right. Instead, he fixed her tea, boiled eggs, left them on the table. When she managed a whisper of thanks, his only answer was, "You rest now. I'll be close." The door clicked shut, and for the first time in years, she slept a full hour, dreamless. Outside, things weren't so still. Roy Lane, humiliated, cut down to the bone by Elias in front of his own mother, found his old pride turned to something bitter. He wandered aimless, then stormed into Buckley's saloon. The men there, Frank Buckley's hired hands, the kind with dust on their knuckles and secrets under their hats, saw Roy's wild eyes and grinned behind their glasses. "Heard you got bested by the old rancher," one of them jeered. Roy didn't answer. He stared at the floor, shame burning hotter than whiskey. Frank Buckley himself sat at the end of the bar, fat and smug, tapping ash from his cigar. "That Boone's got no right," he said quietly, "messin' in family affairs. Maybe we remind him who runs things round here." They raised their glasses, laughing, but Roy's face only got darker. Later that night, when most had left, Buckley pulled Roy aside. "You want payback, son? There's ways." His words slithered in Roy's ear. "Folks like Boone, he thinks he's better than us, better than you. You want your house, your mother, your life back, you gotta take it." Roy left, pulse pounding, carrying anger heavier than any cattle rope. The night wind stung his face, but the words stuck worse than sand in his boots. At the Lane house, Martha tried to stand, fell, then crawled to the table where Elias had left her supper. Her hands shook, but she finished every bite. Later, in the quiet, she heard something, a sound she'd not known in years, the faintest hum of hope, like the first bird after a storm. But it didn't last. Just before dawn, Roy returned. He didn't come alone. Buckley's men lurked near the porch, shadows in the sagebrush. Roy barged in, eyes red. He didn't speak to Martha, only glared. "You let him touch you?" he spat, voice trembling between hurt and rage. "You let that old fool hold you?" Martha backed away, shaking her head. "No, Roy, it wasn't like—" But he didn't listen. "You're my mother," he hissed, voice breaking. "You're all I got, and you let them all see—" He stormed out, kicking a chair so hard it splintered. Martha slid to the floor, clutching her knees, tears hot and useless. Outside, Buckley's men watched Roy with cold interest, whispering about revenge. All that day, whispers grew. Some folks pitied Martha, others whispered she'd brought shame on her boy. Reverend Harlan stopped by, left a loaf of bread, a Bible verse scrawled on paper. "The truth will set you free." But he didn't step inside. No one did. Only Elias that evening found the courage to cross the Lane porch again. He found Martha in the dark, hands folded tight, eyes searching for answers that never came. He sat beside her, not saying much, just close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. For once, she let her head rest on someone else's shoulder. Outside, the wind changed direction. Even the coyotes seemed to howl differently that night. Nothing in Duskwood would ever be the same. The wind in Duskwood carried strange voices that week, snatches of gossip and promises of trouble. Frank Buckley was the sword who didn't forgive slights or let a grudge grow cold. He watched Roy Lane from his porch, sharp-eyed, waiting for the boy's anger to ripen into something useful. Roy started showing up at the saloon more often, slouched at the bar, bitter and restless. Buckley sidled up to him one smoky evening, a smirk hidden in his beard. "A man's got a right to take back what's his," he muttered, filling Roy's glass. "Somebody comes between you and your own blood. That's a line you don't let no one cross." By midnight, Roy was drunk enough to listen. Buckley leaned close. "You help us with a job, and I'll help you remind that old rancher to mind his business. There's more ways than one to teach folks a lesson." The plan took shape in the hush of back rooms and behind locked doors. Buckley's crew wanted Elias Boone off his land, or at least too busy to interfere. Roy, hungry for power and desperate to shake off the shame that clung to him, agreed to help. That same night, the men slipped through the mesquite toward Elias's barn with flasks of lamp oil and sly grins. Martha Lane, sleepless, caught a flicker of orange out her window. She ran barefoot through the dew, dress clinging to her shins. Flames climbed the barn's side like hungry fingers. She screamed, voice hoarse, but the men only laughed, pushing her aside. She tried to fight, tried to shield the horses, but Buckley's men knocked her down, and Roy, face masked by shadow, looked away. Elias saw the blaze from his porch. Without a word, he ran toward the chaos, his old rifle in hand. Buckley's men scattered at the sight, cursing as Elias fired a warning shot overhead. He dashed into the fire, Martha close behind, coughing and choking, dragging a pitchfork through smoke to unbolt the stalls. The horses bucked wild, but Elias calmed them, coaxed them out into the dark. By the time the flames died, the barn was a ruin, blackened beams leaning like broken bones. Martha, bruised and filthy, tried to thank Elias, but words stuck in her throat. She wrapped her old red handkerchief around his burned arm, her hands trembling. He didn't say a word, just let her tie the knot slow and careful, both of them pretending not to notice the tears on her cheeks. Roy watched from the edge of the yard, unseen. Something twisted inside him, seeing his mother care for another man, seeing Elias's hand on her shoulder. Jealousy burned, but shame burned hotter. He wanted to shout, to break something, but the words never came. Instead, he slunk away, hiding in the shadows, heart beating too fast. The next morning, the whole town talked. Some folks blamed Buckley, others whispered about Roy. But Martha and Elias said nothing, tending the wreckage together in silence. Martha's hands were gentle, cleaning the burns on Elias's arm. He flinched once, then let her finish. The red handkerchief stayed, a quiet promise between them. When the sun set, Martha sat on her porch, watching the hills. Elias lingered, silent as always. Roy paced by the creek, torn by what he'd done and what he'd lost. And somewhere in the dark, Frank Buckley planned his next move, knowing this fight wasn't over. The air over Duskwood held a new tension, heavy as a storm that won't break. Nobody slept easy that night. Not Roy, not Martha, not even Elias, who sat up by the window, a loaded rifle across his knees, and his heart caught between old sorrow and new hope. After the barn burned, a hush fell over the Lane house, as if loss itself hung in the rafters. Martha moved through her days on habit alone, knuckles raw, eyes hollow. Elias fixed what he could, working slow, glancing at her from time to time. He offered help with chores or a warm mug at dusk, but she kept her distance, haunted by guilt, fear, and something too old to name. Roy grew worse. He stopped coming home at sundown, disappeared for days, and when he did show up, his eyes were wild. Sometimes he slept in the hayloft, clutching a bottle and muttering to himself. Other times he wandered the hills, aimless as a lost calf, his anger turning inward, chewing him up from the inside out. One night, a hard winter storm rolled in, rattling the cabin and icing the windows. Martha sat up late, patching a shirt by lamplight. The wind howled. She jumped at every creak. When the door finally slammed open, it was Roy, soaked and reeking of rye, hair plastered to his forehead. His face was twisted, almost unrecognizable. A boy nearly vanished. He staggered toward her, voice slurred with hate. "You think you're better than me now? You and that old fool Boone fixing barns together, drinking coffee like family." She tried to answer, but he cut her off, backhanding the cup from her hand. It shattered on the floor. "You think you can just throw me away?" "I never did," Martha said quietly, bracing herself. He grabbed her by the arm, squeezed so hard she winced. "You don't get to choose. You're my mother. You're mine." His grip bruised her skin, but his voice cracked at the end, like a child lost in the dark. Martha's heart broke, but she stared him down, refusing to flinch. "Roy, you don't own me, and you don't have the right to hurt me. Not anymore." He snapped. In a fit of rage, he dragged her outside into the snow, shoving her toward the old cold storage shed behind the barn. "You need to learn. You need to be alone for once. See how it feels." He locked the door behind her, leaving her in darkness, breath frosting in the air. Inside, Martha wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, teeth chattering. She thought of her husband's grave, the barn ashes, Elias's kindness, and Roy's lost eyes. She waited for anger, for tears, but found only a cold, fierce clarity. Meanwhile, Elias had noticed Martha's absence. The snow was thick, but something in his gut told him trouble was near. He roused Reverend Harlan and Ms. Lottie, banging on doors, rallying neighbors for the first time in years. Folks followed him, lanterns bobbing through the storm. At the shed, Roy waited, pacing in the dark. He never expected the town to come. When Elias and the others arrived, their faces set. Roy panicked, grabbing an old axe. But Elias stood firm, unarmed, voice calm. "Let her out, Roy. You don't want to cross this line." Roy shouted, "She's my mother. She was supposed to save me." Martha, hearing the voices, found a sudden strength. She beat her fists on the door. "Enough! You hear me, Roy? I'm done being afraid. I'm done saving you from yourself." Her words rang out clear and strong, even as the storm whipped snow into her face. Roy faltered, tears streaming down his cheeks, a lost boy caught in a man's rage. He dropped the axe, stumbling back. Elias and Harlan forced the door, pulling Martha out, wrapping her in blankets. Roy slumped in the snow, chest heaving, sobs racking his body. Martha stood shakily, snow clinging to her hair. She walked to Roy, looked him in the eye. "I can't fix what's broken in you, but you won't break me, not anymore." For the first time, Roy couldn't look at her. He turned and ran into the storm, disappearing into the darkness. Martha watched him go, tears freezing on her cheeks. The night was still, except for the wind and the sound of old pain finally being set loose. When the sun rose, Martha sat at her table, Elias beside her, hands wrapped around a warm mug. The town had changed. Something inside her had changed, too. She had chosen herself, at last, and there was no going back. Snow still lined the ground days after Roy vanished, crusted hard as old regret. The Lane house was quieter than ever. Martha moved through each morning on sore feet, haunted but alive. Elias patched the barn roof, whistling low, trying not to dwell on how thin Martha looked in the pale winter light. But rest never lasted long out here. One afternoon, while Martha was sweeping ash from the hearth, her broom hit something wedged behind the stones. It was a battered old Bible, stiff with age and soot. She sat at the table, fingers trembling as she opened it. There, tucked inside the faded pages, was a letter, the paper brittle as corn husk. Her husband's handwriting greeted her, the loops shaky but familiar. She read, breath catching as each line peeled back years of silence. "Martha, if you ever find this, know the truth. The land was never safe. Frank Buckley threatened me, said if I didn't sign over the north pasture, he'd make sure I didn't see another spring. I tried to fight him. I failed. If anything happens to me, it's him you should fear, not the shadows in this house." Martha pressed the letter to her chest, heart pounding. For all the years she'd blamed herself, or Roy, or the cold heart of fate, here was proof their suffering was born from another man's greed. That evening she showed Elias the letter. He read it in silence, jaw tightening. "I knew Buckley was a bastard," he muttered, "but this—" Martha's eyes shone with something new, anger and a trembling hope. "All these years, Roy hated me for things I never did. He carried a weight that should have been Buckley's." Elias nodded. "We need to tell him. He deserves to know the truth if we can find him." But Roy was still gone, swallowed by the wilds. For days, Martha barely slept. Then one night, the wind howled so fierce it rattled the window panes. Elias heard a noise in the yard, a horse, restless, stamping at the frozen dirt. He grabbed his coat and shotgun, heart heavy with dread. In the moonlight he saw movement by the edge of the trees. Roy stumbled into the yard, coat torn, hands cut and bleeding. He looked half-starved, wild-eyed, haunted, but behind him, looming like a vulture, was Frank Buckley himself, flanked by two of his hired men. Buckley's voice was smooth as a snake's belly. "Evening, folks. Looks like your boys run out of places to hide." Martha stepped outside, clutching the Bible to her chest. "You've done enough, Frank. Haven't you taken everything?" Buckley sneered. "I only take what's owed. Your man promised me land. When he died, that debt passed to you and your sorry son." Elias squared his shoulders, blocking Buckley's path. "You lay a hand on them and you'll answer to more than just me." Roy collapsed onto the steps, shivering. "Mama, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Tears streaked his dirty face, carving lines through grime. "I thought you were the reason everything went bad." "I was wrong." Martha knelt beside him, pressing the letter into his hand. "This isn't your burden, Roy. It never was. The standoff was thick as gun smoke. Buckley's men looked uneasy, glancing at each other. For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge, but the town wasn't silent anymore. Down the lane, lanterns appeared. Neighbors, ranch hands, Reverend Harlan, even old Billy Crow. One by one, they gathered at the fence, no longer content to look away. Buckley spat, sensing the tide turn. "You think a mob scares me?" But even his own men were shifting now, unwilling to fight the whole valley. Elias spoke, voice like thunder. "You'll leave now, Buckley. You ever set foot here again, you won't leave at all." Buckley scowled, but pride wasn't worth dying for. He mounted up, his men trailing, and rode into the dark. In the silence that followed, Martha wept. Not just for the years lost, but for the truth finally set free. Roy curled up on the porch, broken but no longer alone. Elias watched over them both, hat in hand, the last of the cold wind easing from his bones. Inside, Martha tucked the letter back into the old Bible, setting it high on the mantel. Outside, the townsfolks faded into the night, but the quiet they left behind was no longer heavy with shame. It was laced with hope. The days that followed felt heavy as lead, but a strange kind of peace settled in around the Lane place. Roy spent hours on the porch, head bowed, hands restless, haunted by every cruel word and deed. Martha moved quietly, watching her son with new eyes. A wounded animal, still dangerous but desperate for something he could not name. Elias kept to the yard, fixing fence rails, oiling hinges, his presence steady as bedrock. The townsfolk stopped by more often now, Miss Lottie with a pie, Billy Crow with extra kindling, Reverend Harlan with nothing but silence and a nod. Folks who'd once crossed the street to avoid Martha Lane now lingered a little longer at her gate. But evil don't give up so easy, not out here. Buckley wasn't finished. One night, when the moon hung low and the wind bit sharp, shadows crept up around the house. Roy woke first, heart pounding, hearing the soft crunch of boots on frost. He looked out to see Buckley's men fanned out across the yard, rifles glinting in the lantern glow. Elias was already up, shotgun in hand, jaw set. Martha, shaking, reached for Roy's arm. He pulled away, teeth gritted, shame burning hot as any fever. "This is my mess, Mama. I brought them here." Outside, Buckley himself stepped into the lantern light, a pistol hanging loose at his side. "Thought I told you I'd be back, Lane. Debts don't just vanish 'cause you found your backbone." Elias called from the porch, "You're trespassing, Frank. Go home while you still can." Buckley smirked. "Or what? You'll shoot me in front of your preacher friends? Don't think you've got the guts." He lifted his pistol, waving his men forward. It all happened in a blink. Roy bolted from the porch, yelling, "Leave her alone!" Buckley's pistol barked, the shot cracking through the night. Elias fired back, dropping one of the men to the ground. The rest scattered, some firing wild, some running for cover. Martha screamed as Roy stumbled, blood blooming bright on his shirt. He hit the dirt hard. Elias charged forward, firing twice more, sending Buckley's men fleeing into the dark. Buckley himself slipped away like the coward he was, leaving chaos behind. The dust settled quick. Martha dropped to her knees beside Roy, pressing hands to his wound. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered, voice rough with old grief. Roy tried to speak, his lips trembling. "I'm sorry, Mama, I didn't mean—" His breath rattled, eyes wide with fear and something like relief. Elias knelt beside them, voice low. "We need Doc Morton, now." Billy Crow, who'd been watching from the lane, tore off for town, riding hard. Martha and Elias hauled Roy inside, laid him on the kitchen table. She worked to stop the bleeding, tears falling into the bandages, whispering prayers she'd forgotten she knew. Hours blurred. The doctor finally arrived, face grim, hands steady. He worked in silence while Martha and Elias hovered close. At dawn, he shook his head. He's strong, might pull through if he wants to. Martha sat by Roy's side, holding his hand through the fever. When he woke, pale and weak, he looked at her, really looked, for the first time in years. "You ever forgive me, Mama?" Martha brushed hair from his forehead, her hand gentle, voice steady. "I don't know, son. Maybe forgiveness ain't just a word. Maybe it's something you show, one day at a time." Roy nodded, tears shining in his eyes. He squeezed her hand, holding on like it was the last thing tethering him to this world. Outside, Elias stood guard, shotgun across his lap, watching the horizon for any sign of Buckley or his men. But the danger had shifted. It was inside now. A war fought in the quiet between mother and son, pain and hope, memory and mercy. When the sun finally rose, it warmed the Lane house like a blessing. No one knew what tomorrow might bring, but for the first time, they faced it together, not as victims or enemies, but as what was left of a family. Night pressed hard on Duskwood, colder than a grave and just as silent. Inside the Lane house, Martha watched over Roy, his breath rattling in the dark, sweat chilling on his brow. Each hour crawled by. Elias stayed close, sitting in a kitchen chair with that battered red bandana Martha once used to wipe Roy's nose when he was a boy, now gripped tight in his weathered fist. The doctor's words echoed, "He might make it if he wants to." Martha wondered if wanting was enough, after all that had been lost. Outside, the wind carried whispers from the edge of town. News of the shootout spread fast. Some folks said Roy had finally gotten what he deserved. Others, remembering the mother he'd broken, kept quiet. No one came knocking, not even Reverend Harlan. Duskwood's silence was its own kind of verdict. Inside, Roy drifted between sleep and fever, haunted by old ghosts. He called out for his father, for forgiveness, for a way home. Martha held his hand, thumb tracing the same small scar he'd gotten falling off a fence as a boy. Now he was near grown, but in that moment he was just a scared child, begging the night for another chance. Elias watched from the doorway, head bowed, silent as prayer. Once or twice, Roy's words stumbled into the open. "I'm sorry, Mama. I don't know how to stop hurting you. I just get so mad. I see his face and I can't." Martha squeezed his hand, but her voice wouldn't come. Some wounds cut too deep for words. Toward dawn, Roy's breathing slowed. The fever broke. He opened his eyes, pale as morning milk. Martha leaned in, her face lined with hope and dread. "Roy," she whispered. He stared at her, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. "I'm so tired, Mama. I thought being mean would make me strong, but all it did was make me empty. I don't want to hurt you no more." Tears slid down Martha's cheeks, warm against his cold hand. "You're my boy," she said, voice shaking. "No matter what you've done, that won't change, but it can't keep breaking me either. Rest now." Roy blinked, tears leaking out sideways. "If I could do it over—" She shushed him, brushing damp hair from his face. "Don't worry about the past. Just let go, son." Elias stepped inside, set the red bandana by Roy's pillow, and stood by Martha's side. The three of them lingered there as the world shifted outside, waiting for something like mercy. When the end came, it was quiet. Roy's chest rose, fell, and didn't rise again. No struggle, no final word, just peace. Martha pressed her lips to his forehead, feeling the last bit of warmth fade. She didn't scream. She didn't curse the heavens. She just wept, soft and low, holding her son as the sun broke over the hills, spilling gold across the valley. Elias laid a hand on her shoulder. No words passed between them. The night had taken Roy, but left behind a stillness neither of them had ever known. Outside, birds began to sing, unsure and soft, like the world itself wasn't sure it was allowed to move on. Martha sat for a long time with Roy's hand in hers. remembering every good thing she could, every scrap of laughter, every small kindness, every hope she'd held tight in the dark. Grief poured out slow like molasses, sticky and endless. But beneath it something lighter stirred, a flicker of forgiveness, the hint of a beginning where an ending had seemed certain. Elias watched her, silent and steady, keeping vigil for what came next, after Roy was buried beneath the cottonwoods. Life in Duskwood moved with a hush, as if the earth itself needed time to heal. Martha's steps were slower now, her eyes raw and searching. But a strange kind of peace lingered in her house. The ache of losing a child never left, but it softened, edged out by the living. Elias Boone came by every morning, always with something in his hands, coffee, nails for the porch, a sack of apples bruised but sweet. He never stayed long, never pressed her for talk, just fixed what needed fixing and left the rest alone. The townsfolks watched, their curiosity sharp, but even the sharpest tongue found nothing to say when faced with Martha's quiet dignity and Elias's gentle ways. Some afternoons Miss Lottie would appear, arms full of bread or honey or a scrap of fabric for quilting. Reverend Harlan started dropping off old hymnals and stray books. For the children, he said, even before there were any. It didn't take long before children began drifting in, one by one, the ones who had nowhere else, whose eyes held more years than their faces should. The first was Rosie, no more than 8, left on the porch with a note pinned to her dress. Then came Tommy, bruised and hungry, who wouldn't say where he'd come from. Martha took them all in, never asking, just letting them warm their hands by her fire and find comfort in her kitchen. Some stayed a night, others a season, but each left a mark on that old house, a laugh, a song, a muddy handprint on the wall. Elias built new bunks in the back room. Ms. Lottie taught Rosie how to mend socks. Tommy learned to split wood with Elias, swinging the hatchet with a dogged determination that made Martha smile for the first time in months. Evenings grew gentle in a way Duskwood hadn't known in years. Martha sat on the porch with a mug of tea, listening to children's voices drifting on the wind. Sometimes Elias would sit beside her, not saying much, just sipping his coffee and watching the sun drop behind the ridge. They never spoke of love, never named what held them close. It was there anyway, sturdy as the earth, quiet as forgiveness. Words spread, slow at first, then all at once. Folks with heavy hearts and troubled kin found their way to Martha's door. She gave them what she could, a meal, a place to rest, a lesson in reading, or kindness. She became something Duskwood had never seen, a mother to the lost, a lantern in the storm. Elias stood by, steady as an old oak, never asking for thanks. There were still shadows, still memories that caught Martha off guard, a sudden shout, the slam of a door, but they grew less sharp with each day that passed. The red bandana, once a token of warning and fear, now hung by the window, catching the light like a promise. And though the house was never truly quiet, the chaos held a new kind of hope. Martha found herself humming as she baked bread, smiling when Rosie braided her hair, feeling, at last, that maybe, just maybe, the world was big enough for second chances. One evening, after the children had settled and the crickets had started their song, Martha and Elias sat on the porch. In companionable silence, she glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Thank you," she whispered, not for anything in particular, but for all of it, the steadiness, the kindness, the quiet belief that healing was possible. Elias only nodded, his gaze soft and sure. The sky above them stretched wide and open, the stars blinking into life one by one. Martha closed her eyes and listened to the night, letting the peace settle deep. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now it was enough to simply be, to rest, and to love without needing a name for it. The years passed gentle as a late summer breeze, and in that weathered old house at the edge of Duskwood, time softened its edges. Martha Lane's hair turned silver, her back stooped from 1,000 small kindnesses, but her eyes stayed bright, clear and unyielding, the kind of eyes that had learned to see hope in hard places. By then, the children had grown, most of them taller than Elias, who never lost the habit of calling them kid, no matter how deep their voices got. They still called Martha Ma or Miss Martha, depending on whether they'd stayed a season or a lifetime. And they came back when they could, bringing new little ones to meet the woman who'd patched up not just their knees, but their hearts. On the porch, Martha kept a rocking chair facing the plains. When the weather was fine, she'd sit there with Elias, their knees nearly touching, their words few. The sky above them was big enough to carry every story that had passed through that home, every secret, every ache. Some evenings, when the sun burned low and the air shimmered with memory, Martha would finger the old red bandana she'd tucked inside her apron pocket, a relic from days when a scrap of color was the only way to call for help. Now it was a keepsake, a quiet victory. Duskwood itself had changed. Folks who'd once averted their eyes now brought baskets of eggs or bags of flour for Martha's kitchen. The mayor's wife sent over a pie every Christmas. Reverend Harlan, long retired, dropped by with battered hymnals for the new crop of children. There was a laughter in the schoolhouse Martha built, where no hand was raised in anger and no door was locked at night. Not everyone approved. There were always those who grumbled about wayward children and women meddling where they shouldn't. But their voices faded like wind through dry grass, swallowed up by the quiet revolution Martha had started, one act of mercy at a time. On the eve of her 70th birthday, the children, now grown with families of their own, gathered under the old sycamore out front. They brought food, stories, and memories, filling the yard with music and the smell of cornbread. As dusk fell and lanterns flickered to life, one by one, they stood and spoke the names Martha had given them, a name for each lost child, each broken soul, a name held safe in her heart until it belonged to them. Elias watched from his place beside her, pride shining through the wrinkles on his face. When the last child had spoken, Martha lifted her hand, slow and steady, and tied the red bandana to the lowest branch of the sycamore. The cloth fluttered in the night breeze, no longer a signal of distress, but a banner of survival. As the fire burned low, Martha found herself sitting beside Elias, her hand resting easy in his. The town beyond was quiet, safe in a way she'd only dreamed. She knew trouble might come again. The West was never tame for long. But she also knew that love, even unnamed and unspoken, could outlast any storm. Long after the last lantern had gone out and the children had drifted home, Martha remained on the porch, the scent of wild sage on the wind. She listened to the soft chorus of frogs from the creek, the hush of Elias breathing beside her, and felt the pulse of life, bright and stubborn. In Duskwood, folks spoke of Martha Lane's house as a place where the lost were found, where pain was met with understanding, and where love, unadorned and unassuming, did its work quietly. It was not a story folks told in loud voices, nor one you'd find in a book, but it lingered in the way neighbors waved to one another, in the laughter that rang out at sunset, in the eyes of a child unafraid to ask for a second helping of bread. And sometimes, on a rainy afternoon, someone passing the old Lane house would spy a flash of red in the window, and remember, not all lights are meant to be named, and not all wounds are meant to stay open forever. The prairie kept its secrets, but it kept its promises too. If you made it all the way here, I'd sure love to know you're out there. Drop a 0 or a 1 in the comments if this story touched you, or just say howdy so I know you stopped by. And if you want more Wild West stories full of heart, grit, and a little bit of hope, hit that subscribe button and stick around. There's always another tale just over the next hill.